Thank you, Everett. Good morning.
Good morning.
Everett, your water's to the right, mine is to the left.
Okay, here, let me get my water out of here.
Okay. Say it can stay up here if you want, but you might need it.
Oh, yeah, I might. Go ahead. All right.
It is good to be with you this morning. Thank you for being here. Thanks for weathering the cold weather and some dicey conditions at one point. It was fine when I got here this morning, but afterward it accumulated a little bit of snow and it made some things maybe a little slick, so thanks for being here. You've probably seen in this past week all of the fires that have been going on over in California, all of the damage that has been done over there, all of the homes that have been destroyed. And there have even been, I know of a couple of church buildings that have been destroyed over there. It's been just a devastating time over there, and you can't watch the news without them talking about it right now. There's been all these little fires that have been sprouting up, and then the wind just takes them, and it's going all over the place, and it's all they talk about on the news. All of the attention that these fires have been getting over in California, it's led to our family, or at least me and my mom, having discussions about what do we do if there's a fire in our home. You remember in school you'd have fire drills where the alarms would go off, and one by one you'd go out and you had to be in a single file line and so on and so forth. I don't know of a lot of families that have fire drills at home. We've never had one. Maybe it's a good idea to start having one. Have you ever thought about what you would do in the event of a fire? Some of you, of course, I know haven't had to just think about it, but you've lived it. It's something you obviously don't want to happen, but it's maybe something that you ought to be at least prepared for, even if it's something as simple as thinking about in the event of a fire, what are the few things that you would try to grab as you're exiting your home? That question, of course, depends a lot on what circumstances are going on. Is the fire going on in the middle of the day where you catch it early and you have time to grab a few different things? Or maybe it's in the middle of the night and really all you have time to grab is yourself and you take off? My mom has asked me this question. If there's a fire, what things would I grab? Well, I thought about it for a moment when she asked me that, and I said, well, I'd probably grab my cell phone because it's kind of got everything on it. If I had the know-with-all, I would grab my wallet because it's got my identification and my credit cards and so on. And if I had time, maybe I would want to grab something like my computer or maybe car keys or whatever. I think that's pretty reasonable. But my mother almost acted appalled at the answer that I gave. So I said, well, what would you want me to grab? Well, she made sure that I knew that if I was ever in her house and there was a fire, one of the things, if not the foremost thing that she would want someone to grab would be all of her family albums. To my mother, those family albums are among some of her most prized possessions. Not in terms of monetary value, because they're not worth a lot. They're old photo albums with old pictures in them, but they're worth a lot in terms of the significance and in terms of the importance that they have for her. And I'm sure there are some of you that are a lot like my mother in that regard. Perhaps you place a great deal of value in your family albums. And some of you who have had fires in your homes have felt the pain of albums like these being destroyed. These family albums, they serve as a way for us to go down memory lane, looking at old photos from things like family reunions or looking at old school portraits, or even just some of the mundane photos that your parents would take when they got their first camera. You get a camera, and back then you weren't carrying a camera in your pocket like we do today, and so you had a camera, you took some pictures with it. And we sometimes sing that song, Precious Memories. And our photo albums certainly contain some of those. It's sort of funny thinking about our family albums that we have at home, about how there's these pictures of all of these people that I don't know. I've never met them. Many of them had passed on before I was even born. And yet through these family albums, I can learn about them. And I can even learn about my parents before I was born. I can actually look at pictures of my dad in high school and I can say, wow, I can see him without a beard. I've never seen him without a beard in my lifetime. But I can look back and see him without any facial hair and so on. And I can learn a lot about them, and I can learn about people like my great-grandparents and some distant relatives and people that mean a lot to my parents and to my grandparents, but who I've never known. And this isn't a new thing either. The idea of family albums, it goes quite a way back, and it even goes further back than the invention of photos or even pictures, thinking of drawings and so on. You may be wondering, how is that possible, since a family album is literally an album with pictures in it? Well, it's true that having an album with pictures is a fairly recent phenomenon in the last few dozen years or so. In the grand scheme of things, the idea of having something that you could look back on and learn about your family, that goes way, way back. For example, for centuries, there have been things that have been written and that have been kept in families throughout generations. Things like journals and diaries and so on. I guarantee you, if you had someone's journal or if you had someone's diary, and if they wrote in it consistently for any extended period of time, you would learn quite a lot about that person. And it's not even just things like these, like personal journals, but even just generic stories or historical events that have been written down or told orally over the years. Before we had family albums, these things that were written down and preserved were the primary way that you would learn about people from the past, whether it was people in your family or even just people throughout history. For people in the ancient world, these writings were their family albums. This morning we're starting a new sermon series going through the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And I'm really excited to share and to start this series with you, because what we're looking at really is a family album from the ancient world. In particular, the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which actually is one big book that got broken up, so I'm just going to call it Chronicles. This is a family album for the Jewish people. In particular, it's a family album for the Jewish people who would have been living shortly after their return from Babylonian captivity. At one time, the people of Israel were a large and mighty nation. And they had mighty men as their kings. They had men like David and men like Solomon. But eventually that kingdom became divided, leaving the northern and then the southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And after the kingdoms became divided, they began to become unfaithful to the Lord. Israel to the north doing so pretty much right away, and then Judah slowly but surely getting there as well. Their unfaithfulness to the Lord led to the Lord sending them into exile, culminated with the exile of the kingdom of Judah to Babylon in the early 6th century BC. These were people who had lost everything. They lost their land, they lost their freedom, and they even lost their temple where they could go and where they could worship the Lord. But there eventually came a time for God's people to return to their land and to rebuild the temple so that the Lord could be worshipped. Cyrus, the king of Persia, made a decree for the people of Israel to go back to their land and to rebuild the temple of the Lord. And so they do that. And if you remember from our Wednesday night study a couple years ago from Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll recall that they faced many challenges along the way. The book of Chronicles was written sometime during this period, during the time that the people of Israel are returning to their land, and they're rebuilding their cities, and they're rebuilding the temple. And really, they're rebuilding their identity as a nation and their identity as God's people. Really, they're doing more than just rebuilding their nation. They were restoring their identity. And when you talk about restoration, that carries a different meaning behind it than rebuilding. If you're rebuilding something, then you're building something that had once been torn down, but you can build it any which way that you want. For example, thinking about the fires in California and so on, if you have a home and it gets destroyed some way, whether that's by fire or some other way, if you have a home and it's destroyed, if you rebuild your house, then you don't have to build it the exact same way it was before. If you didn't like the way your kitchen was set up before, I've got great news for you. You don't have to build it the same way again. You can build it however you like. But that's not the case when it comes to restoration. When something is restored, it is brought back to its previous state. And so for the people of Israel, they were in the process of being restored back to being God's chosen people. But for many of them, they didn't know what that was like. Many of them who came back to the land of Israel had never lived in Israel in the first place. Enough time had passed from the beginning of the exile to the end, 70 years, as Jeremiah the prophet says. 70 years has passed, and so there's enough time that's passed during the Babylonian captivity that by the time it has ended, there were many people that were not there who had been there at the beginning. Many of those who were returning to Israel really weren't returning at all. They perhaps were going to the land of Israel for the first time. And so they can't really be restored to something that they don't know anything about. Which is why having something like a family album, so to speak, was so important. They could learn about their fathers. They could learn about the mighty men in their history. They could learn the good things that they did. And they could also learn some of the bad things that they did. And hopefully not repeat those same mistakes. And that's where the book of Chronicles comes into play. Because this book, the book of Chronicles, it serves as a family album of sorts, telling the history of the people of Israel, and even history before Israel, going as far back as the time of Adam and Eve. The book of Chronicles really tells the history of the entire period of the written Old Testament, from the time of Genesis all the way to the time of Malachi, from the Garden of Eden to the restoration of Israel. Most of that history is told by way of genealogy. In the first 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles. You think about introductions to a book of the Bible, there's some pretty great introductions out there. The introduction in John's Gospel is one that comes to mind. That is just a great introduction by way of John. You have some introductions that are short and sweet, like Mark, the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, right? The book of Chronicles, it does not have a short and sweet introduction. This introduction is 9 chapters of genealogies. Some of you, with it being the start of the new year recently, may have started a plan to try to read the whole Bible throughout the year. And there's various ways you can do that. You may have a chronological Bible, or you may have a reading plan where you read different parts every day, but probably the most common way to do it is to just start at the beginning in Genesis and just truck your way through until you get to the end of Revelation. If you do that, there's admittedly some readings you're going to come across that are going to be tough. The book of Chronicles tends to be one of those. Not because of the stories in Chronicles, but because of the 9 chapters of genealogy. In fact, there's probably some who, when they come to this part of Chronicles, if they're reading along and they've made it through some of the tough readings, like in Leviticus and so on, they get on through and they get to 1 Chronicles, and they may say, enough is enough, I'm just skipping ahead to chapter 10 when it begins to talk about David. To a modern reader, such as us, the contents of these genealogies might seem inconsequential. But to the original readers of the book of Chronicles, these genealogies would have been as precious as yours and mine's family albums. Because to them, that's exactly what it is. It's a family album. And since it was their family album back then, that also makes it our family album as their spiritual descendants. After all, in Galatians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul makes the case twice in this chapter that we, the church, are the spiritual descendants and the spiritual heirs of Israel, of those promises given to Abraham long ago. In verses 7 through 9, for example, he says that it's those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. Then in verse 9 he says it's those who are of faith that are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. So he says that, and then you go down to verses 27 and 29, and he says that if we're Christ's, in the beginning is talking about how to become Christ by putting him on in baptism. And he says, if we are Christ's, then we are Abraham's offspring and heirs according to promise. And so we may not have the physical heritage that they had back then, but they are certainly our spiritual family. And so this means that we, just as they did, although it may not be formatted in a way that we may appreciate or that we may be accustomed to, and although they lived under a different covenant than we live under today, we can get quite a lot from reading something like the genealogies of 1 Chronicles chapters 1 through 9. Because that's more than just a family album for the people of Israel. It's the family album of God's family, which includes us today. And it's just as Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where Lance read from in our scripture reading this morning, when in that chapter Paul references the Exodus generation of Israel that succumbed to idolatry and they fell in the wilderness. This is the part, we talked about it a little bit in our Bible class this morning, the evil generation that they're called in Deuteronomy 1. This is the generation that God forbid to enter the promised land. And about that story, Paul tells the Corinthians in verse 11 of that chapter that happened as an example and that it was written down for our instruction. And then he gives them the warning in verse 12 to take heed lest you fall. There are some who think that since Christians are governed by the writings of the New Testament, that we don't have to read the writings of the Old Testament at all, or that preachers shouldn't preach sermons from the Old Testament. And that couldn't be any farther from the truth. On the contrary, the writings of the Old Testament, they serve as the foundation for the writings of the New Testament, which we are governed by. And we come away with a much richer understanding of the New Testament if we also understand the Old Testament. So what sort of things can we get from reading a series of genealogies from several years ago, several thousand years ago? Well, let's spend some time examining that with the rest of our time together here this morning. Don't worry, we're not going to read all 9 chapters. That would take entirely too long. But read these at home. I'm giving you homework. I'm going to quiz you next time. I'm just kidding. But I would like to challenge you to read these 9 chapters of 1 Chronicles on your own. And as you read them, keep some of these things that we're going to see in mind. First, and perhaps most obvious, when one reads through these genealogies, we see and are reminded of some of the great men and women of the Old Testament. These genealogies do, after all, span the entire period of the Old Testament writings, from the time of Genesis through the return of Israel after the Babylonian captivity. In these genealogies, you'll read of people like Adam and Seth and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and on down the list. When we're disconnected from a genealogy, those names are simply that. They're names. They're no more to us than ink on a page when we are disassociated from the genealogy. But when we identify ourselves with that genealogy, when we realize that in addition to this being Israel's heritage, this is also our own spiritual heritage, we can reflect on some of these men and the things that they did, both good and evil. We come across the name Adam, for example, and when you think of Adam, you obviously think of the fall in the garden and all of that, but I can't help but think about going back to our Wednesday night class when Jim last week talked about the dwelling place of God, I can't help but think about how Adam dwelt with God in the Garden of Eden. What an experience that must have been. And then you come across the name Noah, and we think about how Noah believed what God told him, and that he did as God said, and he built the ark, and he built it to the specifications and with the material that God said. And then he saved himself and his household. You come across the name Abraham, and I can't help but think about how great faith Abraham had. He was willing to leave his father's country, and he was willing to wait for the child of promise, with some hiccups along the way, of course. But then he's willing to offer up that son of promise that he waited so long for. These men, among the others, they give us examples of things to do when it comes to the faith, in particular men like Noah and Abraham. But there are, of course, some not so positive names in the genealogies as well. You have the bad along with the good. You come across, for example, the name of Cain. And we think of how Cain killed his brother Abel because Cain's sacrifice was inferior to the sacrifice of his brother Abel. You come across the name which is Judah's firstborn son. We even see the writer of Chronicles mention how was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he was put to death. Then you come across the name of Amnon, David's son, who violated his half-sister Tamar. These are people we can learn from, except in this case we're learning things not to do. And these are more than names that we come across in these genealogies. These are men and women with real stories to tell and with real lessons to learn from. In addition to learning about these different people in these genealogies, we also learn something about God. In particular, we see in these genealogies just how faithful God really is. You can see this just in the sheer volume of the names that are mentioned in these chapters, and with the amount of time and years that are covered. And keep in mind the context of the readers who would have been reading the book of Chronicles as the original audience. These were men and women of Israel who were returning from the Babylonian captivity. And it would have been a great encouragement for them and a testament to God's faithfulness to them to see just how far back their heritage really goes, and to know the fact that God has preserved them all of this time, especially in light of some of that negative behavior that was shown by a great many of the people listed in these genealogies, and the behavior which put them in that captivity in the first place. The genealogies, they showcase God's faithfulness to His people. He has kept them and He has preserved them, even through things like the exile in Babylon. God has time over time shown His faithfulness to them, even in times when they were not faithful to Him. You can also, of course, see God's faithfulness and His love and His grace and His mercy in some of the individual stories of some of these men and women in these genealogies. Think, for example, about God's faithfulness to Abraham. God asked quite a lot of Abraham, whether it was leaving his father's house or whether it was waiting patiently for the son of the promise. And in these situations, we see that God was faithful in what He had told Abraham that He was going to do. That son of promise did come. That land that his children would inherit, that did come. We also see God's mercy on display when you come to the lineage of David, especially coming to the children that David had with Bathsheba. Although that story, interestingly, is not recorded in Chronicles, and you could maybe talk about why some things are in Chronicles, or not in Chronicles, that are in other accounts in Samuel and in Kings. The story of David and Bathsheba is not recorded in Chronicles, but you can see the parties involved in David's genealogy from 1 Chronicles chapter 3. And it recalls, of course, how David committed adultery with Bathsheba. and how David went to great lengths in order to try to cover up his affair with Bathsheba, and how Bathsheba conceived a child, and how David eventually orchestrated the death of Bathsheba's husband Uriah out on the battlefield. We see God's faithfulness on display in the simple fact that David was able to be forgiven of those sins, and that David, even to this day, is thought of as a man after God's own heart. Finally, in addition to learning about the men and women of these genealogies, and in addition to seeing the faithfulness of God on display in these genealogies, we also see that these genealogies point us forward to the coming Messiah, who is, of course, Jesus the Christ. While it's true that Israel at that time was in the process of being restored as God's chosen people, there was one piece of their identity that still needed to be brought back. They had returned to their land, and they had rebuilt their temple, but they still did not have a king. On the contrary, not only did Israel not have a king, but they were ruled, for the most part, under the thumb of a foreign superpower. First you had Persia, later Greece, and then eventually Rome. As long as the people of Israel did not have a king, they felt as if it was not a full restoration. In their eyes, they were at their peak as a people and as a nation during the time when their kingdom was united. It was one kingdom and not two, and when they had mighty kings like David and like Solomon sitting on the throne. As they read through those genealogies, and they come across names of the kings that they had previously, the kings that reigned in Jerusalem, they would have likely longed for things to go back to those times. Times when Israel was independent. Times when they had a godly ruler reigning from the throne in Jerusalem. It's also possible that as they looked at the list of those kings in 1 Chronicles 3, those descendants of David, and those are for the most part the kings that reigned in Jerusalem for the kingdom of Judah, from David and Solomon going all the way down to Jeconiah and Zedekiah, as they looked at all of those kings, descendants of David, perhaps the promise that God had made to David, which is recorded in this book in 1 Chronicles chapter 17, perhaps that promise of one of David's sons reigning forever, perhaps that promise echoed in their minds. They longed for the kingdom to be restored, and they longed for David's lineage to rule from the throne once again. All of this, of course, points ahead to the coming Christ, the Son of God, a man by the name of Jesus, who was born from the lineage of David, born in the city of David, who would come and establish his kingdom, and who reigns to this very day. This kingdom is, of course, not an earthly kingdom like the Jews had longed for. This is a spiritual kingdom. It's a kingdom that, in Jesus' words to Pilate, is not of this world. It's a kingdom with an eternal king, one who is the King of kings and the Lord of lords, one who, just as God had promised to David, will not depart from the throne. That king, of course, is King Jesus. And that kingdom is, of course, the kingdom of God, also known as the church, which you and I, if we are in Christ, are citizens of. It's fitting, of course, that in two gospel accounts, in Matthew and in Luke, you can read of another genealogy, the genealogy of Jesus. A genealogy that happens to share many of the names that are in the genealogies and Chronicles. As God's people, the book of Chronicles, it wasn't just Israel's family album, but it is also our family album, showcasing the history of God's people going all the way back to Adam, with each page and with each word, including the genealogies in the first 9 chapters. There are many things that we can take even us that are living today, even us that are living under a different covenant than they did back then. As precious as some of our own family albums are to us, I hope that you'll find this family album, the book of Chronicles, to be just as precious. This album tells the story of our spiritual heritage. It tells the story of our Lord Jesus Christ. This morning, if you find yourself not a part of God's family, if you have not done what needs to be done in order to become a member of the household of God and to be added to this great family, won't you do what needs to be done? Or if you have been an unfaithful member of this family, won't you come back and renew your devotion to the Lord? This family has a great heritage. And the faithful members of this family will be together in heaven someday. If you're subject to the Lord's invitation to salvation this morning, or if you have any other spiritual needs, won't you come now as we stand and as we sing?